Member for Cochrane Valley.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today and speak to the Environmental Assessment Act. This legislation offers us an opportunity to enhance sustainability in all senses of the word: environmental, economic, social, and cultural. As we move forward in an era of reconciliation, it is essential that we recognize, both in our words and in our actions, the principles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In an era of climate change, it is also essential that we consider the far-reaching impacts of resource management practices and that we manage our ecosystems holistically. It is for these reasons that the legislation before us today is critically important. For too long in British Columbia, we have failed to adequately assess the environmental impacts of our actions, with numerous consequences. We have seen firsthand how logging can endanger a watershed, or how project approvals have failed to acknowledge the associated greenhouse gas emissions. We have also witnessed the disproportionate impacts of these consequences on Indigenous peoples. As the Federal Court of Appeal ruled just a few months ago, the federal government failed to adequately consult First Nations impacted by the Trans Mountain Pipeline project. This decision has signaled to all of us that we can and must do better. British Columbia was one of the first provinces to establish environmental assessment legislation in the 1990s. Although this legislation has been adjusted over the years, many voices have said it was insufficient. Several years ago, the Environmental Law Centre at University of Victoria reported that BC's environmental assessment process, quotes, suffers from a clear lack of public confidence. In 2011, the Auditor General published a report on the post-certification stage of government's environmental assessment process. The report found that, quote, the Environmental Assessment Office is not evaluating the effectiveness of environmental assessment mitigation measures to ensure that projects are achieving the desired outcomes. It also found that the Environmental Assessment Office was, quote, not making appropriate monitoring, compliance, and outcome information available to the public to ensure accountability. In 2017, we committed to revitalizing this legislation. It was a key shared policy initiative outlined in the Confidence and Supply Agreement between our caucus and government. Another key initiative in CASA is a renewed commitment to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. This spring, we updated our targets for dramatic cuts to carbon pollution as stated in the Greenhouse Gas Reductions Target Act. The commitment is a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from 2007 levels by 2030, and I would like to emphasize that this is not a target that we can afford to miss. As highlighted by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report released a few weeks ago, without urgent action on this file, the consequences will be life-threatening. For that reason, I am pleased to see that this legislation is consistent with the commitments made earlier this year, as it requires that every environmental assessment considers a project's greenhouse gas emissions and its direct impacts on our targets. It also requires assessments to reflect identified government policies, which could be used to incorporate application of climate strategies. I do, however, Honourable Speaker, have some reservations. This legislation does not appear to require an assessment to consider the life cycle and lifespan emissions of a project, which is vital. It doesn't matter if a project or facility is the, quote, cleanest, if it has already blown through our carbon budget upstream. And while greenhouse gas emissions must be considered, the ministers can still approve projects that will impair BC's ability to meet its legislated emission reduction targets. I appreciate a minister needs to be able to use their discretion when evaluating the complex matrix of costs and benefits that every project exists within. The legislation as presented is asking us to trust the government to make the right decision. So far, governments have not done enough to inspire trust that those decisions will favor reducing the flow of greenhouse gas emissions over reducing the flow of money, despite the threats we face. It is challenging to leave such an important decision to trust. In the span of just a few centuries, Earth has made a transition from a past when climate affected the evolution of human societies to the present in which humans are affecting the evolution of the climate system. Today we are at a pivotal moment in human history. Our generation will be responsible for deciding what path the future climate will take. We know that global warming will lead to increasing likelihood of summer droughts. This in turn will lead to more and more extensive wildfires. We know that precipitation extremes will increase and that flooding events will be on the rise. At the rate we are going, we are looking at between 20 and 50% of the world's species, almost certainly including the iconic Fraser River sockeye, becoming committed to extinction in this century. Global warming is a threat to our economic well-being. It is a threat to our human well-being. If the environment in which we live is unwell, we too will be unwell. The current state of BC's climate is not, quote, the new normal, as many were saying this summer from under the cloud of smoke. Normal implies a plateau and consistency. We are not on a plateau. We are on a steep trend towards increasingly extreme events. I'm sad to say this is just the beginning, and what is occurring worldwide pales in comparison to what we have in store. The world's leading climate scientists warned we only have a dozen years to keep global warming to a maximum of 1.5 degrees Celsius, beyond which even half a degree will significantly worsen the risks of drought, floods, extreme heat, and poverty for hundreds of millions of people. So it is hard to trust that we'll be okay in the face of such dire warnings when our legislation allows climate targets to be compromised, as long as the minister considers them first. I know an Environmental Assessment Act can't save the world single-handedly, no matter how strong it is, but it needs to be sharp and it needs to do its part. We need to ensure it is structured in a way that will support bold climate action in the years ahead. I'd also like to note that as a policy taker, not policy maker, the Environmental Assessment Office will work to ensure proponents follow other climate laws and regulations. Our caucus has been working with government over the last year to improve those policies as well. I'm hopeful they will further strengthen this new environmental assessment process and vice versa. I've also been working a lot on land use and land management issues this year. Many, if not most of them, come down to the need to be able to evaluate the big picture of what is happening in BC. Like the age-old tragedy of the commons, in a shared resource system, if individual users act independently according to their own self-interest, their collective action will deplete or spoil the resource and have a negative impact on the common good of all users. If one of us chops down a tree, Honourable Speaker, or dumps wastewater into a river, it may not be a big deal. But if we all do it, we're in trouble. As our population grows and development creeps across our province, it is government's responsibility to keep a keen eye on the big picture. Government needs to be able to draw the line when an area has reached its limit. Too many ecosystems and wildlife populations in BC are being systematically managed to the brink of collapse. Clearly, government needs a better way to evaluate the cumulative impacts of multiple projects or developments. It is not good enough for each actor to mitigate their own impact. To avoid a death by 1,000 cuts, we need to be able to look at the whole picture and make decisions accordingly. With that in mind, I am keenly interested in the regional assessment potential in this legislation. We need an environmental assessment system that includes higher-level assessment and planning that addresses big-picture regional and strategic issues up front, such as how to effectively manage cumulative impacts in a region in order to establish management requirements that apply to project assessments and provincial decisions. I appreciate this is a very complex goal, but it is one worth working towards. The legislation in front of us does not fill in the details about how regional assessments can be incorporated, but it does include language that will enable that work to be done over the next year. Other positive aspects of Bill 51 include mandatory consideration in project assessment of consistency with relevant land use plans, including Indigenous land use plans. BC will be enabled to enter into agreements with other jurisdictions, including Indigenous nations, regarding conducting or implementing regional and strategic assessments and provisions that are included to allow Indigenous nations to request a cooperation agreement or regional or strategic assessment. Another promising development, in the new EA process, the Minister will have the power to order a project assessment to be paused pending the outcome of a regional or strategic assessment or other investigation or inquiry. That said, I am concerned there is no language in this bill that would serve as triggers for when regional or strategic assessment should occur. I'm also concerned that I do not see any mechanisms in this bill that would allow the public to request regional or strategic assessments. I think that would be a valuable addition, as often it is the local community who has the best understanding of everything going on in their area and the cumulative impact that may be having. And much like the climate test, the outcomes of a regional or strategic assessment would not be binding in a project environmental assessment. Overall, I think the ability to conduct comprehensive regional assessments is a really promising addition. We're part of the way there, but the work done in regulations will make or break it. An act is nothing without adequate supporting regulations. We don't have to look far to find an example. BC's Water Sustainability Act is a great piece of legislation, but its empty regulations prevent it from fulfilling its promise and purpose to improve and protect water management in our province. The Polis Water Project at the University of Victoria has highlighted the useful tools offered by the Water Sustainability Act, but many of them have yet to be realized. There remains a great deal of uncertainty around how the core water planning features will be utilized, and communities are falling through the cracks. For instance, and to provide some examples that were also impacted by professional reliance failures, in Peachland, residents have seen boil water advisories increase as impacts from industry have accumulated in their watershed. In the Halkar Valley, groundwater monitoring was insufficient in detecting water quality concerns before it became a crisis. In the small community of Weimar, residents are concerned about logging in their small, already stressed watershed. They are worried that forestry management decisions are not taking into account impacts on other ecosystem factors. If the tools in the Water Sustainability Act had been adequately implemented for the benefit of communities in the 2 years since the legislation passed, these impacted British Columbians would have more tools, resources, and clarity in how they can go about protecting their local watersheds. Regulations are important. They indicate how legislation will manifest on the ground, and they give stakeholders the tools they need. The Environmental Assessment Act before us today leaves many components up to regulations, and for that reason, I urge government to proceed thoughtfully and expediently with the necessary regulations. One of the key aspects of this new legislation is increased capacity for public engagement, though I think it could be taken further. The communities I just mentioned, Peachland, Halkar, Weimar, all organized to call attention to their struggles with water management. This is an experience I know well. When the Shawnigan watershed was threatened by contaminated soil, our community got involved. We wrote over 300 letters to the statutory decision maker. We sent hundreds more to MLAs, ministers, and the former premier. We collected over 15,000 signatures and presented them in the legislature, and we gathered 1,600 people on the lawn calling attention to the issue at hand. Over the past 2 decades, in the face of deteriorating environmental protections and unraveling compliance and enforcement measures, British Columbians have mobilized. Letter-writing campaigns and protests began the shift that led to the legislation before us today. People have a right to know about the projects that will impact them, and they have a right to give us, the project proponents, their feedback. I'm happy to note that under the new legislation, the public will be engaged earlier in the assessment process. There will also be more public engagement periods at different steps along the way. This improved engagement and transparency goes a long way towards rebuilding the trust that has been lost in BC. Trust is a net positive for professionals, public, government, and industry alike. If we know that the decision-making process has the best interests and key values of British Columbians at heart, our industries will be more competitive and our province healthier as a whole. I will be canvassing all of these sections in greater detail in committee stage to ensure they will fully accomplish our shared goal of restoring and earning public trust. I'm also pleased to note the recognition of First Nations as key decision makers in our province. This legislation explicitly ties the principles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It is the first legislation in British Columbia to do so. This act states that one of the foundational purposes of the Environmental Assessment Office is to support reconciliation by recognizing the inherent jurisdiction of Indigenous nations and their right to participate in decision-making. The new environmental assessment enables Indigenous-led assessments and studies. It requires that the Environmental Assessment Office seek consensus throughout the process. This is significant. For a very long time, Indigenous peoples in BC have been denied jurisdiction over their lands, their resources, and even their children. This is still ongoing. We live in an era where Indigenous peoples continue to face systemic barriers. Many Indigenous communities, the number has grown as of today, continue to lack access to clean water. The number of Indigenous children in care is at crisis levels, and as the Federal Court of Appeal recently emphasized, the consideration of Indigenous rights and perspectives in resource decisions has so far been inadequate at best. The legislation on the table today demonstrates a commitment to doing better. It is a commitment that we absolutely must see through. To quote Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, recognizing Indigenous governments, laws, jurisdictions, and decision-making is an essential part of reconciliation, and the legislation today is a small step in the right direction. I'm encouraged by the legislation before us today. For too long, mismanagement has compromised public trust, Indigenous rights, and environmental health. For too long, projects have been improved with inadequate consideration for the long-lasting impacts they will have for ecosystems and the people and animals who depend on them. Today, we have an opportunity to change how we make decisions going forward. We have an opportunity to include the public in a transparent process and to adequately and meaningfully collaborate with Indigenous people. There remains much work to be done to realize true reconciliation, just as there are items that will need to be addressed in order for this legislation to adequately protect the environmental health of our province. Today, however, we see British Columbia shifting in the direction of an accountable and equitable environmental assessment process. Moving forward, I am hopeful that British Columbians can begin to trust that the decisions made in our province do indeed protect the economic, social, and ecological values that they hold dear. Thank you.